somewhat partly into the interview when I was fumbling and not connecting with him. And he picked it up and he said, "Hello? Hello? Hello?" And I thought, oh, geez, are they trying to triangulate on him? And do they know I'm here? And I had put my trust in, I hope the Mossad's really good and they won't kill me too. And anyway, I decided not to move my chair back. I was thinking about the 14 centimeters. My students laughed at me later. They said, the ceiling would have come down, everything would have come down, we'd all be dead. And anyway, then he threw his phone down and he looked at me and he saw that I hadn't moved. And I suddenly got higher in his esteem. But anyway, then when I explained this concept of dissociation to him, he said, I have that. And one time I was surrounded by the Israelis and I was in this little house and I knew they were going to kill me. And I made up my mind I'm going to be a martyr. And he said, I opened the door and he said, something switched in me right before I opened the door because I was going to run out, I was going to shoot as many as I can, but I was going to go down as a martyr, and I knew it. And he said, something switched, and I said, no, I'm a fighter. And he ran out, and I guess he didn't shoot at them, he just ran like a rabbit, and he got lucky, got hit in the leg, but he got away. And he's now, I think, been given amnesty, but he was under a hit list for a long time. And anyway, he said, the people that come to me volunteering themselves to be suicide bombers are always in that dissociative state. And he said, you're right, they have really deep traumas. People have been killed or things have happened to them that they are always dissociating. And he didn't say it so clinically, but he had picked up on what I was talking about. And he said, the rest of us, the fighters, move in and out of that. And he said, for me, I go in that at night. And he was very afraid that the Israelis had a stealth and that it was flying overhead and that it was locating him and that was going to kill him. And when I told the Israelis that, they laughed so hard. And they were like, that's good, he thinks that. And, anyway, he talked about at night that he would kind of leave himself and just be kind of in a crazed state. And that he had to do things to bring himself back into his body and into his mind. So he would do things like shoot his gun, and Muslims don't like dogs, or a lot of Muslims don't like dogs, and so he would shoot dogs. And his cadres were like, that's you at night? That's you that shoots those dogs? And he's like, yeah, kind of gotta get myself back into my body, and that's how I do it. And so it was a fascinating interview. And what I found with many of these people that were going to be suicide bombers, that they had this dissociative tendency. And when I looked at the martyrdom ideology, I thought this is the greatest psychological first aid for someone with PTSD. Because you're giving them something that really calms them, that they start to believe in. You're telling them, I can address your psyche. You're in so much pain, and you'll only see that and I should have said with the normal suicide research, that we know that the greatest predictor from studies here of people committing suicide is that they're in what Ed Schneiderman called psych-ache. And that means you're in so much pain, you can't see any alternatives, and you just have to get out of the pain. Like when you don't want to take Advil, but you just got to go get that Advil because, whatever's hurting her. Well, I got to go get the gun or the rope or whatever because there's just no way out of this pain, and I got to get out of it. So this group comes to them and says, I've got the way out of the pain for you, and it's a glorious exit, and you'll be very revered, and you'll win one for our side, and all these other things that they say to them. And so it calms them because now they see their exit. And we do see that people before they go on suicide oftentimes improve. That's a worry thing for clinicians, that if you're treating somebody that's very, very depressed and suicidal and they suddenly feel great, watch out. And unless you suddenly got them on a psychotropic or something. And anyway, so I also got into the Israeli prisons, and I talked to a woman that told me that a similar story, that she, well, actually, maybe I should skip her story, and I'll tell you about the woman after her, because I'm watching the clock, and I want to leave you time for questions. The woman behind her told us about that she had waited, I think it was 40 to 60 days to carry her bomb. She had seen the militant action in Jenin where they had surrounded the fighters, and she was particularly fixated on that a little baby was killed in that action. And there were Israeli soldiers that were killed, there were militants that were killed, but what she was really fixated on was that a little Palestinian baby had been killed. And she talked about it as though she'd seen it with her own eyes. And that's the other thing you oftentimes see with terrorists in conflict zones, that they're very emotional about what they've seen on TV. And it feels like they saw it with their own eyes. So they really internalize it. And it's probably because it's happening around them, even though they didn't see that dead baby or any dead baby, they know the truth of it, it resonates with them. And so she had volunteered herself to the group. The group checked her out, and they decided, yes, they would take her. And she was somebody that didn't have a history of PTSD. She was more just really blown away by all the traumas that she saw, and she wanted to do something heroic. She wanted to be recognized, and she was willing to give her life to do it. And my colleague, to get into the Israeli prison, I went in with an Israeli, Yoram Schweitzer. And Yoram is very confrontational in his approach, and I'm not. I'm very soft and very like trying to get into their head and feel what they're feeling. And he said, there's no way that you could have waited 40 days for your bomb. It's humanly impossible. You know, you just would have been out of your mind waiting for a bomb. It's not, you couldn't do it. And she said, no, I did. I waited for 40 days, and and Yoram had promised me that I could run the interviews. And I was like, shut up, Yoram, shut up. And anyway, so it went back and forth between us, Yoram confronting her and me asking her, but eventually the story came out that she said she was supposed to cross the checkpoint, then she would be given the bomb. So she didn't have the bomb in her physical hands, and then she would go and carry out her act. And she described to us that for 40 days she sat in her family. She was in a dissociative state. She was just out here, not really feeling anything. And she was looking at her family members, and she was saying, goodbye, Mom. Goodbye, Dad. And really love you, Auntie. And she described being euphoric. And she said she felt like a saint. She felt very blessed. And she got kind of giggly while she was talking about it. And I asked the translator, and the person that translated was the interview before, who really trusted me because she really opened up in the interview. And I wanted to interview not in Hebrew, I wanted to interview in Arabic. And this woman was capable of that. So I turned to Erin and I said, Erin, I want to ask her, was she sleeping with anybody or was she doing any drugs and alcohol during this time? And Erin said, you can't ask that. That's a really insulting question. And look at her, she's so young, it's no way. And I said, no, please ask her and please explain. I don't mean an insult. I just want to know what this is about, the giggly drunkenness. And she said, okay, I'll ask her. So she asked her, and the girl's eyes got real big, and she said, no, I never did drugs or drank. No, I didn't have sex with anybody. And we don't know if she's telling the truth or not. But then I said, do you see how you're acting like what we normally think of as drunkenness? And I looked at Erin, and Erin said, yeah, she looks drunk. And what was happening is this woman was having such a strong recall of those 40 days of her euphoria. She was doing it in front of us. She had entered that state again, where she was just like dizzy, drunk with this power and dissociated state of, I am leaving my body. I am going somewhere else. I'm going on a suicide trip to paradise. And what was interesting, in the same time frame, I had a student, and if you want to read more in depth, you can read my academic papers or you can read the book, and I'm sorry, I'm going to rush through this. But I had a student, the one that got me into all of this, he'd been in a bombing in Hebrew U. And he'd gone as an exchange student, and he, on his first day there, went into Hebrew U, met an Israeli soldier. They had a little bit of a discussion where they disagreed. Ken walked out, and the cafeteria at Hebrew U blew up. And Ken was, of course, never the same. And that's why he wanted me to go with him into the Palestinian territories, not just study the Chechens. And Ken was playing some of this out in our class, his PTSD, in one of the classes that I was teaching. And he was doing a role play, and he kept getting really emotional when he would role play with a Palestinian about what had happened to him. And he was supposed to be interviewing the Palestinian about suicide terrorism, you know, kind of what makes you tick interview. The interview is like what I did. And, but he kept getting mixed up. And at one point, Al, who was playing the Palestinian and doing a really good job of it because I had coached him how to do it, Ken leapt across his chair and strangled Al and said, you know, GD, I'm a effing Irishman, why did you want to kill me? And I don't know, he worked through some of his trauma, but we kept pushing Ken to do these interviews over and over and over again so he could learn how to do an interview and not emote from his own trauma. And he wanted to do this. This is a kid that, you know, I said, do you want therapy outside of class? Because maybe it would be better to do it that way. No. I want to do what I'm doing in class, okay? And I thought they're psychology students, they'll all learn a lot, and they did. And anyway, we decided that the people that were playing the Palestinian every time were getting so deep into the role that was kind of fascinating. So we decided to recruit, and I think we recruited about 25 students. We published the paper, I don't remember. But we asked 25 students that we just pulled out from the hall, and we did a thought experiment with them. And we said, would you be willing to pretend that you were arrested and you were a Palestinian suicide bomber? And I don't know if you know anything about the conflict there, but here's a few details of it. And the only thing we want you to stick in your role of that you volunteered yourself to be a suicide bomber, that you chose your own target, that you actually put on the suicide vest and went to your target and you were arrested at that point. Now you're in prison and we're going to interview you. Do you agree? And we had done, you know, like a pre-interview about are you suicidal or, you know, is this going to tip you over the edge? And they all thought we were crazy, but they were like, yeah, sure. And I think I already had a reputation at the university. And anyway, so they sat in a chair and we said, you know, how's it in prison? You know, what kind of family do you have? And blah, blah, blah. And we took them along and they went deep into the role. And they described things like how they picked their target and different things. But the most fascinating part of that thought experiment was we said, okay, you were given the suicide vest. When you put it on, how did you feel? And over 30% of the sample said, I was euphoric. I was flying over my body. You know, the things that real suicide bombers said. And we were like, oh, wow, this is very strange. So there must be some mechanism in us that has to leave a little bit to be able to contemplate exploding ourselves, whether we're going to explode ourselves just on a solo mission or, you know, take other people with us. And for me, that has to do with PTSD, because we know that PTSD has dissociative features and that groups can use this. They can manipulate it. And so that's a little bit about individual motivations in conflict zones. But what if you go to a place like Belgium? We had Muriel de Koch that went down to Iraq. London had their suicide bombers. Morocco, Casablanca had suicide bombers. These are all non-conflict zones. How do those people get motivated? And for them, it's much more about being a part of a social group that's marginalized and discriminated against, being young people in search of adventure, being convinced by a group and an ideology that they'll be a hero, and also taking what's happening in the conflict zones and bringing it through pictures and film into the non-conflict zone and indoctrinating them in a way that almost causes a secondary traumatization. So they watch enough films that they can't stand it anymore and they're willing to go and do something. And they get really agitated and they want to do something. And I can tell you a few examples from Belgium and London as well, but I've already went farther than I meant to in taking the time, and I wonder if I should give you the opportunity to ask questions instead of tell you more stories. So yeah, go ahead. Yep.
You mentioned, or it was somewhere, that you've also taught the hostages, like
Yes.
from the Belarus children and all that. But it seems that you haven't said that the persons that are willing to take this disassociation and trauma and turned into a suicide bomber are persons who were the hostages. So there's kind of a dichotomy there that you would think that they would have that trauma, but they don't. Hostages don't seem to be typically who, and yet we have teenagers here from the United States who are willing to go across the world, and they were involved.
No, that's a very common question that I get asked. Of there's the hostages from Beslan and Nordost. They were terribly traumatized. We can look in Kashmir. We can look in Iraq. We can look in Afghanistan. The years of conflict there. There's probably 85% trauma rates in those countries. And why does only a subsection of them go to terrorism? And the answer I would give you for that is it's about exposure. So I lived in Belarus, and that's a highly traumatized society, and we've never seen anything like that arise out of Belarus. And the culture is very different. They're taught, be quiet, don't get noticed, don't fight your government, stay safe, because they have a history of Black Marias driving up to the houses and taking people that resisted the government out to the woods and shooting them, and they end up being found in mass graves later. So if you belong to a culture that tells you don't resist in this way, and there's nobody offering you even the possibility to resist in this way, you can't really become a terrorist. But if you live in Palestine or Chechnya, where you know exactly where to find them, a subset will go. And it's a good question of what makes them go. And sometimes it's a tipping point. So there was a woman in Bethlehem that they killed her boyfriend, and she had no interest in terrorism within 2 weeks. She totally changed her way of dressing. She went to Hamas and said, give me a bomb, and she went to the site with the bomb strapped onto her body and then decided not to carry it out. I interviewed her in prison. But, and other people do try to find their way into terrorist groups and can't get in, or they're turned away, like Zubeidi told us. So it's not just trauma. It's a group, it's an ideology, it's some level of social support. I mean, we have Tamerlan Tsarnaev. He had probably, what would we say, 2% support in Boston. You know, he had a little bit extremist element. He had a teacher that was teaching him some extremist ideas, but you know, he wasn't surrounded